Hello, Park High School. Welcome back to another round of notes. This is your first notes of the third trimester, which is chapter 10. We're going to be covering development. Key issues 1 and 2, which are going to answer the essential questions. Why does development vary amongst countries, and where are inequalities in developed countries distributed? So here we go. All right, so first question is how do we define development? And that is, here's our GeoNerd version of this: the process of improving the material and conditions of people through the diffusion of knowledge and technology, right? That's a really sweet, nice way of putting it, but we can also just get real here for a moment and say this is rich countries and poor countries. This is a good quality of life and a not a good quality of life. This is places where people want to live and where people don't want to live. These are the haves and the have-nots, right? We often think of this as a spectrum. So you have MDCs, or more developed countries, which we are going to call in your book is called developed countries, right? Versus LDCs, or developing countries. And LDC stands for less developing countries, or less developed countries. If you were to talk to an older person about this, like me, for example, because I'm old, the Cold War era terminology was first world, second world, and third world, right? And the third world was the poorest parts of the world. The second world was the communist world. And then the first world was the God-fearing, democratic, capitalistic, Western, right, America and their all allies. So again, we look at it as a continuum. Please note that there are NICs right in here, which stands for newly industrialized country. And newly industrialized countries are going to be countries that are in the middle. Sometimes their statistics are going to look like a developed place. Sometimes it's going to look very developing. So these are going to be countries, we use the term BRIC, B-R-I-C, or BRICS, BRICS, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Right? And these are countries that are going to, sometimes, again, they're going to sometimes look like they're more, sometimes they're going to look like they're less. All right, another good one would be Mexico, would fit that piece. So there's our Cold War categorization. You see the green is the first world, right? You see Western Europe, you see North America, you see Japan and Australia, New Zealand, right? The second world is going to be the communist world, which is going to include Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, China, and Mongolia. And then the third world is everybody else: Latin America, or Africa, all of Africa, and then Southwest Asia and South Asia and places like that, Southeast Asia too. All right, so if we get a bit more of a colorful map, we can look at developed and developing regions, right? You look at our developing regions, and you know this by now. This is not a new concept to you, right? North America, Europe, Japan, and then the South Pacific, which is, what we call Oceania sometimes. And then you have the developing regions, right, where you have Latin America and you have East Asia, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Southwest Asia, South Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. And then you have Russia in there as well. And again, Russia is a bit of a wild card. Back to how we measure development, right? We take into account social, demographic, and economic factors. So it's not just money, but money is an important piece. And we're going to start off with that. But we are going to look at a composite index. An index is a group of statistics, right? And the United Nations has come up with something called the Human Development Index. And it's comprised of gross national income, GNI, which we'll learn about a little later, mean years of education, expected years of education, and life expectancy. And you roll all those up, and there's an equation that they come up with, and you get a number on a scale of 0 to 1, right? And at one point, the highest was Norway, and the lowest was Niger at 0.34. And you can see here, this is in your book, it looks at how we do measure these things: knowledge, decent standard of living, which is GNI per capita, life expectancy, long and healthy life, right? Things like that. Right. Another way we can look at it is the PQLI, which is the Physical Quality of Life Index, and that's a formula that uses life expectancy, infant mortality rate, and literacy rate. It's not as popular, but it is another way, another index that we could use. Right. So there's our HDI. When we break it down again, right, and we have a very, very aqua teal map here. But it looks at 0.79 and above, right? And you can start to see these maps. So what does development map look like? Hopefully by now you know what a development map looks like, and this would be a quintessential development map because it's the HDI. All right. Here is our current HDI rankings. Actually, this is not our current. This is 2018 rankings, and you notice that the United States is wow, we're number 15. All right. But if you look at and if you glance at this, and if you hit pause on this video, you start looking, and you can see the regions really play out. That you're going to see a lot of Western European countries. You're going to see some places like Hong Kong, right, which is part of the People's Republic of China, but is largely autonomous and has a separate economy, and is very developed compared to Greater China. Right, you see North American countries, you're going to see Australia, New Zealand in there as well. All right, here is a blurry version of the 2019 version of this, and you can see that the United States is now 17. Right, now keep in mind it is 17, it is almost 18 at a 0.922 versus a 0.926 for the United States, but it's almost 16 as well because it is only 0.003 away from the Canadians, right? So you can see up at the top, right, there isn't that big a difference, but it does add up, right? These do add up, the big difference between Norway, right, and the United States. All right, so here's our HDI when we look at developed and developing, right, our different regions as well, because they do, we can talk about this regionally too, right? So ways that we measure economic development. All right, remember there are three ways. There's economic, there's social, and there's demographic statistics that we look at. So GDP, gross domestic product, or gross national product sometimes. What's produced in a country versus what's produced by a country, and we'll talk about G&I here in a second as well. This is the value of all goods and services produced within or by a country in a year. Right? We often divide this by population or per capita. And it measures mean wealth. But what it doesn't do is talk about distribution, right? And so that is an important piece that you need to remember, is that gross domestic product, particularly when it's divided per capita, doesn't tell you if there's any sort of income gap, right? And places like the United States has a huge income gap. There's the top 2% of the population makes a lot of money compared to the bottom 20%. Latin America has huge income gaps as well. Right. We can also look at categories of jobs, right? And we've already gone through these things. What we will talk about industry in our next chapter. But when we talked about chapter 9, that was our primary sector. That's farming, fishing, mining, things like that, but mostly farming. Our secondary sector is going to be industry, right? Manufacturing or processing. And then our tertiary sector is services, and that's what we got in chapter 12, and we related that to urban geography in chapter 13. That's going to be things like teaching geography, or processing meals at McDonald's, or retailing, or bank, or working in the healthcare industry. All right, total GDP. If we look at it, total GDP, we look at where things are here, but remember that we tend to break that down per capita. So note the difference between this and this next one, right? And China looks much less rich when you have to take into account all the money and divide it by the 1.3 billion Chinese, right? Same with India, right? If you have a total number and you have 1.3 billion people working hard and producing things, you're going to have a pretty high number. But when you have to divide it by those 1.3 billion, it tends to look, right, a little different. So remember that GDP per capita norms the statistic, and you can compare a country like Italy to a country like China. All right. Again, when we talk about development and sectors, we look at the United States. About 3/4 of the population works in tertiary, right? Lots of services. You have some industry, and then you have very little primary sector because our farmers are very productive. Because workers in developed places are much more productive because they have technology. If you look at Brazil, it's pretty much well split, right? A newly industrialized country. And then you look at a developing country like Nepal, where you have 4 out of every 5, 81% of people who are working in the primary sector, and that's largely going to be farming. Right? You only have 16% working in services, and you have very little industry at all. So how does this relate to the DTM, or the demographic transition model, from chapter 2? Note that basically stage 2 is going to be your developing countries. Remember, there are no countries in stage 1. Stage 3 are going to be your newly industrialized countries. And stage 4 are going to be your developed, or MDCs. Right? If we start looking at where jobs exist, we do see primary sector jobs are falling across the board here. That they've dropped 10% in developing countries, and they've shrunk down here as well. Note that services have gone up, right, in both developed and developing countries. So GNI is another important indicator here. Again, it's part of the HDI. So it's similar to GDP, but with context to a global economy. So it's going to use this equation. It's going to talk about all the money that's produced in a country plus the income received from investments outside of the country. Right? So if you have American corporations that are operating overseas, that's going to be included as well. And then you have to subtract payments to other countries. So, it's going to measure whether or not you have a trade gap as well. So you can see GNI in trillions in the developed world, right? You see North America and Europe, Japan, South Korea in there, and then you have your developing countries as well. But if you look again, like those small places, right? The developed world is very small, but it does accumulate a lot of income. All right, other things we look at is purchasing power parity, or PPP. Right? It's a measure of how many units of currency are needed in one country to buy the amount of goods and services that unit of currency will buy in another country. So it's kind of an inflation index in a lot of ways. So oftentimes they'll use something, kind of a cheeky thing. They'll use the Big Mac index, right? And they'll talk about how many Big Macs you can get. So if you look at this one, it says that in the United States, a Big Mac is $3.41. Right? And so from there, you measure how many Big Macs can you get, what is the cost of a Big Mac that you can get in Argentina or Australia or things like that, right? If you had $100 to buy groceries, how many groceries could you get for $100 if that $100 is measured in equal amounts of currency in different places, right? So it's how much buying power that you have, or purchasing power. One other thing that's not really in the book is called the informal economy, right? It's the economy that is kind of under the table economy. It's generally cash-based or barter-based. It is not counted as taxed income. It's not measured. It's not counted towards GDP or GNI. And you see this kind of informal economy existing in squatter settlements, in slum areas, in poorer regions of the world, or in poorer regions of countries. And so you think about, again, like repair or salvaging or trading or barter. The lemonade stand would be, kind of your informal economy, that nobody makes you fill out tax forms for a lemonade stand, right? So under the table, things like that. Remittances, right, work as well if they're in cash, can be part of the informal economy too. You caught that sneeze. I'm going to take a little break and I will be right back. And I'm back and feeling better. So let's move on. All right, so I did mention productivity as well, but we will also talk, there are other economic indicators. Access to consumer goods. How many cell phones are available? How many cars per capita? How many televisions, or things along those lines, right? Those would be other indicators of development. Productivity, right, is another thing to look at. start looking at things like value added per capita, right? Productivity is generally going to be greater in MDCs because of machines, tools, equipments that are kind of the right stuff. So there's motor vehicles per person. Again, we see per 1,000 people, so it's normed again. And you look and you do see a clear connection to the developed world versus the developing world, right? Access to technology. Here's cell phones per 1,000 persons, and this is interesting. We do see a higher correlation in Europe, and then this is again where we look at the curious case of Russia, right, where they have more cell phones per capita than the United States or Canada, right? Internet users per 1,000 people, right? We see a clear correlation between the developed and developing in the number of internet users, right? The availability of technology in a developed place, right, really affects your quality of life, and so you can see that as well. All right, social indicators are going to be things that are basically going to be health and welfare and literacy and education. We look at the education rate, we look at student-teacher ratio, we look at the average number of years per school, right? On the health side of things, we look at things like calorie consumption, doctors, nurses, hospital beds, things like that per capita. Right? And then healthcare expenditures we can look at as well, the amount of money that the government puts towards healthcare. Although that is, you see this sometimes, there's a big asterisk because the United States spends more on healthcare than any other country, but has lower life expectancies and higher infant mortality rates and maternal mortality rates. Some of that has to do with, perhaps the insurance piece that goes with that, the ability to get healthcare in the United States, adequate healthcare. All right, so there's student-teacher ratio. Generally, a higher number is for developed country or developing countries, and a lower number is for developed countries, right? And the idea is that if you have lower class sizes, that you have more personal attention and better access to education, right? If you're in a classroom of 50, you're not going to get as much, time with a teacher as you would be in a class of 15. So again, these are averages, right? So, very few of you have teacher ratios that are below 15 in your classes, right? There might be a handful of classes that you'll get at Park High School when it comes to that. But it keeps in mind that this is going to be for K-12. It's going to work into colleges and things like that as well. There's the mean years of schooling, right? 10 and above, right, is generally accepted in the developed world. Whereas you see things that are below 7, right, at some points, and then between 7 and 9, right? And again, we look at education as a privilege. We look at education as a means to increasing productivity and moving up, right? And we tie that to development, and it's pretty clear that you can see that here. Right, expected years of schooling, we look at the same way, right? The years that you are expected to be in school, 14 and above. Right, as opposed to below 12, right, in the developed world in sub-Saharan Africa. Right, there's caloric intake. The United States and most of Europe is at 140%, and above on average. Right, now keep in mind that we broad brush these places. There are places that are well undernourished in are a lot closer to 100 in the United States, and then there are places that are better fed. That food insecurity is a real thing in the United States and other parts of the world, right? So keep in mind that these are measured by country and they're not measured within a country. And then again, we look at below 100 in sub-Saharan Africa, and then we're looking at malnourishment, right? And food, being deprived of food and calories and protein in particular, right? Which is going to lead to then higher, not infant mortality rates, but child mortality rates. So there's doctors. Again, curious case of Russia. Russia has more doctors per person than the United States and some other places as well. All right. Demographic indicators of development, things like life expectancy, infant mortality rate, natural increase rate, birth rate, dependency ratio, right? If you have a high dependency ratio that has a high number of older people than you that are dependent, so 65 and older, that's a sign of a developed place. Whereas if you have a high number of young people, that's generally going to be a stage 2 country. Gender balance too. If you have more women than men, that's generally a developed place. If you have more men than women, that is generally a developing place, right? And that has to do with life expectancy and women living longer. For a gender balance of that's slanted towards women, you tend to have if you have a place that has more men, we tend to look at a less developed place, and we start talking about maternal mortality rates, which we'll get to at the end of our section here. All right, so there's life expectancy at birth. Again, we look at developing and developed, right, as well. All right, and we see that. We look at inequalities, right? We look at inequality adjusted HDI or IHDI. It modifies the HDI to account for inequalities within a country, right? So the lower the HDI number, the more inequalities within a country. And again, we look at, and it looks a lot like an HDI map, right? But it does take into account some things that have to do with what happens within a country, right? If there's pockets of development, if there's economic backwaters, if there's things like that. All right. This leads us then to the core periphery model, right? Core and periphery, right? Which is another name for Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory, right? And in the world systems theory, Wallerstein's theory, there is a core which requires a lot of education, has a lot of technology and infrastructure already there. There's high wages, there's benefits, and this generates wealth, right? The opposite of that is the periphery, which you see in the green, right? And it requires little or labor, right? There's low wages. There's lack of control of political and economic affairs, which is going to lead us into our neocolonialism and things that the book doesn't talk about, but you need to know. So think of the core as MDCs, right? And you see high profit and consumer goods being sold to the periphery. And then the semi-periphery, think of that as NICs. Sometimes they operate like the core, sometimes they operate like the periphery, right? The periphery provides the core with cheap labor and raw materials, right? So this is this explains things in terms of connections, right? And essentially it says that the core is rich because it takes advantage of the periphery, right? That it uses the cheap labor and raw materials of the periphery to create wealth, right? And then the periphery is poor because the core is rich, and the core is rich because the periphery is poor. The periphery sometimes, semi-periphery sometimes gets used, and sometimes it uses. Sometimes it's being used by the core, sometimes it's using the periphery, right? So again, relationships between places. So the Wallerstein theory is an interesting one, right? So that leads us then to the core and periphery model, right? Which expands on the world systems theory, right? And it takes it a little bit of step further, right? And it classifies places into 4 different categories instead of 3. The core and the periphery, right? Instead of the core, you have the industrial core. Instead of the periphery, you have something called the resource frontier, where it provides resources and cheap labor, right, to the industrial core. And then you have the upward and downward transition areas. And upward and downward, right? That the people are areas and places that are on the come up, right? That are looking to push to be more like the industrial core are there. And then you have the downward transition, where people who were, or places that were in a downward transition, where you see a loss of industry and you see a loss of jobs. This is good because it takes into account scale. You can use this on many different scales. You can use this within a city, right? Places that are the historical hotbed of rich, where the stuff is being made and the wealth is being generated, right? You have the poorer parts, and then you have the places that are being perhaps gentrified, right? And then you have the kind of the places that used to be in favor but are now out of favor would be the downward transition area. And you can look at a city this way, you can look at a country this way, you can look at a state this way, you can look at a region this way, right? And you can look at the globe this way too. So it is interesting, right, as to what is developed and what is developing. And the idea is, you might want to ask the question, where does the U.S. fit into this category? Are we a center for manufacturing and industry anymore? Are we in a downward transition? Are we in an upward transition? Is this a valid way to look at things? So that leads us to another model, which is called neocolonialism, right? And it is going to expand on some of the ideas of the world systems theory, right? So it's also known as post-colonialism, and we look at this as the entrenchment of the colonial order, such as trade and investment, under a new name. So it's no longer it's the relationship between the colonized and the colonizers, right? So it's imperialism. It goes through here, right? And it is looking at neocolonialism as a place, or as places that are in the developing world that are still under kind of economic and political control, through economic means than through political means, by their former colonizers, right? So we look at organizations like the International Monetary Fund. We look at the World Bank. Sometimes has contributes to this idea. Right, MDCs are able to dictate precisely what LDC's economic policies are. They're able to use economic subsidies to put LDCs and industries out of businesses. Right, so if you look at how a farmer in the United States, right, has advantages that a farmer in Mexico doesn't, we can see, maybe something along those lines. Right, not that Mexico was colonized by the United States. All right. Another way to look at this is structuralist theory, right? And it explains the differences levels of development as a result of historically deprived power relations within the global economic systems. It is related to neocolonialism. I don't think you need to know vast differences between structuralist theory and neocolonialism. You should have an understanding of generally how they work, right? It says that MDCs still control LDCs through unfair trade practices, or arrangements or deals. LDCs are not independent, right? So they're still kind of reliant on that. So the structure of the economic structure is what keeps LDCs L, less developed, right, and MDCs M for more, right? It does go against Rostow, which we'll get to in our later theory, right? And it believes that Rostow is going to be, it's a response to Rostow, right? And you'll learn more about Rostow in 10.3, 10.4, right? The third way to look at this, which is, or a third name for this form of structuralist theory, is called dependency theory, right? And it's a critique of the modernization theory, which is the Rostow theory. Right? And it's based on the idea that colonialism has created economic and political structures that have caused colonies to remain dependent on colonial powers. Right? And this again keeps LDCs less developed and keeps MDCs at an advantage. All right. Another way, a dependency theory example is something called dollarization. Right? And dollarization is where you tie your economic structure, your currency, to that of a stronger currency, right? Like the US dollar. LDCs attach their currency to those of MDCs. It abandons their currency, their current currency, and adopts the currency of the MDC. And that can be good in that if you are starting to use American dollars are generally more stable than the peso, right, or the bolivar, or whatever the currency is in some Latin American countries, right? It adapts, if you adapt the U.S. dollar, but you need to keep in mind that the policies that the Federal Reserve puts in place are not meant to help in El Salvador or another Latin American country. They're meant to help the United States, right? And so it can have indirect negative effects. So it's an interesting, again, dependency theory. We're dependent on the dollar, right, in other places. Right, so again, we look at the euro or the dollar adaptations. We see these in here, right? You see Latin America. Dollarization is generally a Latin American thing, whereas Euroization, if that's even a word, right, has been tied to sub-Saharan Africa, Western Africa in particular. All right, so looking at inequalities that exist within countries, right? Please remember that this happens in a lot of places, right? So we're using the idea of Brazil as a good example of that, right? That the GDP per capita in places like Bahia, right, or Sierra, right, or Para, these places are generally economic backwaters. Whereas you look at the developed coast here, where you have Sao Paulo and Rio, right, you see a lot more development along here. All right, and right, Minas Gerais is the mining district there as well, so it's somewhere in the middle between those, kind of a buffer. Right, so we can look at this in the United States and the difference, right? The inequalities can be in developed countries too. Differences, and you know this, that the generally the South is, in the 1950s has that, we can see a clear difference here, but we do see. The gap between the rich and poor has expanded, right, from the 1980s, but we have seen this even out just a little bit, right, in terms of the South being less poor, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in chapter 11 when we talk about industry and how that has moved to the South. All right, widening inequalities in MDCs. Again, we see the United States, the United Kingdom, right? We see those things, happening from the 40s to the 50s, right? We see it's shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and then it's back on the rise again. All right, so I've used the term economic backwaters, so let's introduce that term formally. The regions that fail to gain from national economic development, right? Best example of that is interior China, right? Interior China has generally a lot of poor rice farmers, whereas the East Coast is booming with industry and factories and all of that powerhouse of the juggernaut of the Chinese economy. Generally is concentrated in the coastal regions. Buenos Aires, right, is a good example of a growth pole, whereas the rest of Argentina is generally an economic backwater. So think about that when it comes to primate cities, right? Or sometimes, the other parts, you're going to see that maybe in places where there's a primate city rule happening. We see this again in poorest parts of the United States too. Right, and again, once you are down and out, it is really hard to come back up because people leave, right? And when people leave, you have lower tax base, right? And it's harder to attract investment and jobs and to reverse that downward trend. All right, on to gender, right? So just so we know, so we are perfectly, understanding of where we're at when it comes to gender equality, right? And when I do talk about gender, I talk about gender being, not necessarily sex, but gender, right? And how people view themselves, right? Whether that's, we don't necessarily have good statistics in this day and age of those who don't fit into the male female, right? Who can relate that way. So I do want to make it clear that this is not a complete measure, right? That there are people, non-binary people don't necessarily, or gender fluid people may switch, right, as well. Just so you know, the UN, no country has perfect gender equality, but that should not be a surprise to you, right? MDCs generally have higher equality than LDCs, right? We talk about the Gender Inequality Index, or GII, which resembles kind of the IHDI. It's going to compare places within a country, right? But in this case, it's going to compare genders, right? Measures the achievement using reproductive health, empowerment, labor markets, things like that. So it's there's a good part of the book is going to discuss that, and we will get to it. There's the gender related development index as well, or the GDI. It's going to resemble the HDI, except it's going to adjust to reflect gender differences. So it's going to compare income, education, life expectancy as well. All right, so here is the Gender Inequality Index. Right, and generally you see that correlation, right? And a lower number is good than a higher number, and that means that there's not as much difference between males and females in a country. So we see that in Western Europe, we see that in North America, we see that in the developed world. We also see it in China, right? Which is part of that leveling that goes with the Communist Party, right? That there's maybe less room with a crackdown government for discrimination, which is kind of ironic, right? Considering the human rights records of the Chinese government. All right, so what factors are used in GII? We have the gender empowerment, right, which refers to the ability of women to achieve improvements in their own status through economic and political power, right? So we're looking at that in terms of a number of seats held by women, how many legislative seats, right? And we see that, and this is vastly shifting, right? We see more and more women running for office. We've seen a large uptick since 2016 across the political spectrum of women running for office, right? So that's an interesting upward trend, which is fairly encouraging, right? Because if we think about half of our population is female, about half of our leaders then should be female, right? By that reasoning, we look at the percentage of people with some school education, right? And that's going to be a high school education as well, and we see females and males, and we're starting to see a shift, right? So we see the pink countries here where there are more females than males with some secondary school education. All right, employment, right, is female labor force participation, right, is the rate of percentage of women holding down full-time jobs outside the home. Again, you see a clear correlation to development here. But actually, we see a clear correlation. But then there's some, we see this interesting trend here in Southeast Africa, right, along these lines. And we look at that when we look at women in agriculture as well. We see a high number of women in agriculture here. Right? So other factors used, we look at reproductive health, adolescent fertility rate, right? So it's the number of births per 1,000 people of ages 15 through 19, right? So the teen moms, if you will, right? So we look at the difference there, and we see almost about 3 times, right? The amount of, exactly 3 times developed versus developing. There's 3 times more teenage moms in developing places than in developed places, right? Now, keep in mind that this also ranges in terms of within a country too, right? And populations as well. And we also look at maternal mortality rate, right? Which is the number of women who die giving birth per 100,000 births, right? And we look at the difference, the vast difference, 16 versus 171, right? And the United States is at an interesting turning point here where maternal mortality rates are on the rise, right? And they are largely happening in rural places because of funding and hospitals and maternity wards, right? Birthing places are largely drying up because of cost in rural places. And women who are giving birth in rural spots in the United States are much more likely to suffer, right? Not and maybe even fatally, right, to the point of mortality. So these are some interesting things to think about as you move through this. All right. So there's adolescent fertility and also maternal mortality rates. Again, clear correlations between the developed and the developing world. Right, and that is 10.1 and 10.2. So please make sure that you use this video, that you're reviewing your notes, that you are working on your guided reading, and you are coming prepared when it comes time for the exam. Take care. Bye-bye.